The hum of the city had quieted down as midnight approached. The streets, once alive with bustling energy, were now nearly empty. Mike's taxi rolled slowly through the dimly lit roads, the familiar sound of the engine humming like a lullaby. It had been a long day, and his hands gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, a subtle ache reminding him of the years he'd spent behind it. Mike glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 11:45 p.m. Almost time to call it a night, he muttered, his voice breaking the silence in the cab. The thought of heading home brought a mix of relief and resignation. He had done this for years, navigating the streets, picking up strangers, listening to their stories, and earning just enough to keep the lights on. As he waited at a red light, his mind wandered to his daughter, Emma. She was his pride and joy, a college sophomore studying to become a teacher. The apartment felt emptier without her, but Mike had made peace with that. Every mile he drove, every fare he collected, was for her future. Just a few more years, he thought, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Then she won't have to worry about anything. Still, the weariness was hard to ignore. His body ached from the long hours, and his soul felt stretched thin. But despite the fatigue, there was pride in his work. Each ride wasn't just a job. It was a connection, a story shared, a small moment in someone else's journey. As the light turned green, Mike sighed and turned on his "for hire" sign one last time. "One more ride," he said softly. "Then I'm done for the night." Mike drove through the quiet streets, scanning for potential passengers. The city had a way of surprising him, even on the slowest nights. Just as he was about to turn off his "for hire" sign and head home, a figure emerged under a flickering streetlight. She stood with one arm raised, her silhouette barely visible against the dim backdrop. Pulling over, Mike saw a young woman approach the cab. Her shoulders were hunched, and she clutched a small bag tightly against her chest. She looked around nervously before opening the door and sliding into the back seat. "Where to?" Mike asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. The woman hesitated, her voice barely audible. "Just drive for now. I'll tell you when to stop." Mike frowned slightly but didn't press her. Something about her demeanor felt off. Her disheveled hair, tear-streaked face, and trembling hands. She seemed lost, not just in the physical sense but emotionally too. As the cab rolled forward, the woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, keeping her gaze fixed outside the window. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Mike had seen plenty of passengers in all states of mind, but this one tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. "Rough night?" he asked gently, breaking the silence. She didn't respond at first, her jaw tightening as she hugged the bag closer. Finally, she whispered, "You could say that." Mike nodded, sensing that pushing her for details wouldn't help. Instead, he focused on driving, navigating the winding streets as the city lights flickered past. Minutes passed, and the woman began to relax slightly, though her hands still gripped the bag like a lifeline. Mike stole another glance at her in the mirror. There was something raw and vulnerable in her expression, something that told him she needed more than just a ride tonight. "Take your time," he said quietly. "Let me know where you need to go when you're ready." Her lips quivered, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Mike kept driving, letting the silence say what words couldn't. For now, he knew just being there was enough. The hum of the engine filled the cab as Mike continued driving through the quiet streets, the tension in the air palpable. He glanced again at the rearview mirror. The woman's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the passing streetlights, but her shoulders had begun to sag, the sharp edge of her fear dulling slightly. Mike decided to try again. "You know," he started, keeping his voice steady and warm, "I've been driving this cab for years. Met all kinds of people. Some happy, some sad, some just plain tired. But you," he paused, searching for the right words. "You look like you've had one of the tougher days." For a moment, it seemed like she wouldn't respond. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag, and she opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it again. Then, almost reluctantly, she whispered, "I left him." Mike's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't need to ask who him was. The crack in her voice, The way she held herself, the fear in her eyes. It all pointed to the same story he'd seen too many times on the news or heard from passengers before. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said carefully. "But it sounds like it took a lot of courage to do that." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Courage? I don't feel brave. I feel lost, like I'm running away from my own shadow." Mike nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do. It means you're choosing to protect yourself, even if it's hard." Her eyes flickered up to meet his in the mirror, a glimmer of disbelief breaking through her despair. "Do you really think so?" "I do," he said firmly. "I've been through my share of tough times too. Lost my wife years ago, left me to raise my daughter alone. There were days I didn't think I'd make it, but I kept going for her. Sometimes, all you can do is take one step at a time and trust that the road will lead you somewhere better." The woman's lip quivered, and tears welled in her eyes. "I've been with him for 5 years, she admitted. "He always said he'd change. But tonight," her voice broke, and she clutched the bag tighter. "Tonight, I knew he wouldn't. Not ever." Mike felt a pang of anger on her behalf but kept his tone calm. "Good for you," he said softly, "for knowing your worth and deciding you deserve better. That takes strength." She exhaled shakily, her fingers loosening their grip on the bag. "I left with nothing but this," she said, gesturing to the small bag. "No money, no clothes, no plan. Just enough courage to get in this cab." Mike's heart ached for her, but he also felt a swell of admiration. "Well," he said, glancing back at her with a faint smile, "it seems to me you've got the most important thing packed in there, hope." Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "You're the first person to say something kind to me in months," she murmured. Mike chuckled softly. "Kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it's worth a lot." For the first time that night, the woman sat a little straighter in her seat. Though her journey was far from over, something had shifted. A flicker of strength reignited within her. As the city lights blurred past, Mike knew this wasn't just another ride. This was a moment, a connection, that neither of them would forget. For now, his job was simple. Keep driving and make sure she reached the next step in her journey safely. The cityscape outside the cab slowly changed from bustling streets to quieter residential neighborhoods. The woman, Sarah, had finally given Mike an address. Her friend's house, a safe haven where she planned to stay for the night. As they approached the destination, Mike noticed her fidgeting again, her fingers drumming nervously against her bag. "Almost there," Mike said gently, trying to reassure her. She nodded, but the tension didn't leave her face. When they pulled up to a modest house with a dim porch light, Sarah hesitated. She didn't get out right away. Instead, she rummaged through her bag with increasing desperation. "Everything okay?" Mike asked, turning slightly in his seat. Sarah's breathing quickened. I can't find my wallet," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. She began pulling out items. A small phone, a few toiletries, and some papers, but no wallet. Mike watched her, his heart sinking. "Take a deep breath," he said calmly. "Maybe you left it somewhere earlier." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "I must have left it at his place," she said, her voice breaking. "Oh God, what am I going to do? I can't pay you. I can't even—" Mike raised a hand to stop her. "Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice steady and kind. "You don't need to worry about the fare. This one's on me." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "No, I can't. I'll pay you back as soon as I can, I promise." "Don't worry about it," Mike interrupted, shaking his head. "I've been where you are, starting over with nothing. It's tough, but you'll get through it. And tonight, you've got one less thing to stress about." Sarah stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "Just take care of yourself," Mike replied, offering a small smile. "That's enough for me." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and opened the door slowly. Before stepping out, she turned back to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Mike watched as she walked up the path to the house, her small bag slung over her shoulder. She rang the doorbell, and a moment later, a woman opened the door and pulled Sarah into a hug. As Mike drove away, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for what Sarah had endured, pride for having helped, and a sense of hope that she'd find her way. That's what it's all about, he murmured to himself, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. The night was dark and quiet again, but something in Mike's heart felt lighter. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference. And tonight he'd done something that truly mattered. The hum of the engine faded as Mike pulled into the parking lot of his modest apartment building. Shutting off the ignition, he sat in the stillness for a moment, his hands resting on the wheel. The events of the night played back in his mind. The tears in Sarah's eyes, the desperation in her voice, and the way she clutched that small bag as though her life depended on it. He leaned back in his seat and let out a deep sigh. Life doesn't get any easier, does it? He muttered to himself. Inside his apartment, the familiar quiet greeted him. The place was tidy but sparse, just enough furniture to fill the small rooms, with a few framed pictures of his daughter, Emma, scattered around. The photo on the mantel caught his eye. It was a snapshot of the two of them at her high school graduation. Her smile, bright and confident, had been his anchor on days when the world felt heavy. Mike sank into the worn couch and picked up his phone. The late hour gave him pause, but he decided to call Emma anyway. She answered on the second ring, her voice groggy but warm. "Dad? Is everything okay?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Everything's fine," he replied. "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause on the line. "You sound tired," she said softly. "I am," he admitted with a chuckle. "Long day. But I was just thinking about how proud I am of you. You're doing great things, Emma. I just want you to know that." Her voice softened even more. "Thanks, Dad. I love you. I love you too, kiddo," he said, his chest tightening with emotion. After they hung up, Mike sat in the quiet again, reflecting on the night. Helping Sarah had stirred something in him, a reminder of how fragile life could be and how much even a small gesture could mean to someone in need. As he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps, in his own small way, he'd helped steer someone else's life back onto the right path. The thought brought a faint smile to his face. Tomorrow would be another day, another set of stories waiting to unfold. But tonight he felt a deep sense of peace. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, it's the rides we don't plan that take us the farthest. 3 days had passed since that late-night ride, and Mike had almost convinced himself he'd never hear from Sarah again. He didn't expect anything in return. It wasn't why he did it. Still, her story lingered in his mind, resurfacing each time he picked up a new fare. It was a quiet afternoon when his phone rang, the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Random calls were rarely good news, but something urged him to answer. "Hello," Mike said cautiously. There was a brief pause before a familiar voice spoke, trembling slightly. "Mike?" "Sarah." From the other night, Mike sat up straighter, a flicker of relief and curiosity sparking in his chest. "Sarah. Hey, how are you doing?" I'm okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "Better than I was, thanks to you. I just wanted to call and thank you again. For listening, for driving me, for being so kind. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten into your cab that night." "You don't have to thank me," Mike replied, leaning back in his chair. "I'm just glad you're safe." There was another pause before Sarah spoke again, her tone more determined. "I need to tell you something. My friend, the one I stayed with, she works with a nonprofit organization. They help people rebuild their lives after situations like mine. When I told her about you, about how you helped me even though you didn't have to, she wanted to help you in return." Mike frowned slightly, unsure where this was going. "Help me? Sarah, you don't owe me anything." "I know," she said quickly. "And this isn't about that. It's about paying kindness forward. My friend told me the organization can provide assistance to people like you, hardworking people who give so much but don't always get enough back. They can help with things like repairing your taxi or even finding other opportunities if you ever need them." Mike felt his chest tighten, a mix of gratitude and discomfort bubbling to the surface. "That's really generous, but I don't know. I've never been good at taking help. I get that, Sarah said softly. But you helped me when I had nothing. Letting someone help you doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Please just think about it. You deserve it. Her words struck a chord, and Mike found himself nodding, even though she couldn't see him. Okay, he said finally. I'll think about it. Thank you, Sarah said, relief evident in her voice. And thank you again for everything. I don't know if I can ever repay you, but I'll try to make the most of the chance you gave me. As the call ended, Mike sat in silence, staring at his phone. He hadn't expected anything from Sarah, but this was something he never saw coming. It was a reminder that the smallest acts of kindness often had ripple effects far beyond what anyone could imagine. The idea of accepting help from Sarah's friend lingered in Mike's mind as he went about his usual routine. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had spent his entire life working hard, providing for himself and his daughter. Taking charity, even from a well-meaning stranger, felt foreign to him. Still, he couldn't ignore the practical truth. His taxi was barely holding together. The engine made unsettling noises when it idled, and the tires were dangerously worn. Repairs had been on his to-do list for months, but there was never enough money to cover them. A week after Sarah's call, Mike found himself dialing the number she had given him. The voice on the other end belonged to Lisa, Sarah's friend and the representative of the nonprofit organization. She was warm and understanding, making the process feel less daunting. Mike, she said after he introduced himself, Sarah told me about you. You don't know how much your kindness meant to her. We want to extend that same kindness to you. This isn't charity, it's recognition for the kind of person you are. Let us help you. Mike hesitated but eventually agreed to meet Lisa in person. A few days later, they sat in a cozy office, where Lisa laid out the details. The organization would cover the cost of repairing his taxi, ensuring it was in top condition. They also offered him the option of transitioning into a community outreach role within their nonprofit, a chance to use his experiences to help others in need. Mike was overwhelmed. The idea of fixing his taxi without financial strain was tempting, but the opportunity to do something more meaningful tugged at his heart. He thought of Sarah, of all the people he'd driven who had silently carried their struggles. I don't know what to say, he finally admitted. Just say yes, Lisa replied with a smile. You've already done so much. Let us help you take the next step. After a long pause, Mike nodded. Okay, let's do this. As he left the office that day, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in years, Mike felt like his life was moving in a new direction. One where he wasn't just surviving but truly living. The repairs on Mike's taxi were completed within weeks, transforming his worn-out cab into a vehicle that looked and felt brand new. Driving it for the first time was almost surreal. The engine purred like it was fresh off the lot, and the smooth ride made him feel like he was gliding over the city streets. For the first time in years, he wasn't worrying about breakdowns or unexpected repair bills. But something even more remarkable began to take shape. The time Mike spent working with Lisa and the nonprofit opened his eyes to how many people were struggling silently, just like Sarah had been. He realized that his one small act of kindness hadn't just helped her. It had created a ripple effect, inspiring her to reach out to others and bring him into a network of changemakers. One evening, as he drove through the city, he spotted a young man standing on the curb, visibly distressed. Mike pulled over and rolled down the window. Need a ride? He asked. The man hesitated, then nodded and climbed into the back seat. As they drove, Mike noticed the man fidgeting nervously, much like Sarah had that night. Rough day? Mike asked, his tone warm and familiar. The man sighed. You could say that. Just trying to figure things out. Mike didn't push, but as the ride continued, the man opened up, sharing his fears about losing his job and being unable to support his family. When they arrived at the destination, the man reached for his wallet, but Mike waved him off. This one's on me, he said with a smile. Take care of yourself, all right? The man stared at him, stunned. Are you sure? I'm sure, Mike interrupted. Just pay it forward when you can. That night, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A deep sense of purpose. He realized he could do more than just drive people from place to place. He could be a light for those in dark moments, just as he had been for Sarah. Word began to spread about Mike's Last Fare initiative, a simple but powerful promise to offer free rides to those in need. Other drivers started joining in, inspired by his story. What began as a single act of kindness had blossomed into a movement, proving that even the smallest gestures could change lives. Months had passed since that fateful night when Sarah entered Mike's cab, and his life began to change. The Last Fare initiative had gained traction in the community, with more drivers stepping up to offer support to people in need. Mike had never sought recognition, but the ripple effect of his actions had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mike parked his cab near a community center, where he had been invited to speak about his initiative. He wasn't used to being the center of attention and felt a bit nervous. As he stepped into the room, he was greeted by warm applause and smiling faces. In the front row sat Sarah, beaming with pride. Beside her were 3 women, each holding small tokens, flowers, a thank you card, and even a framed photo of their families. After Mike's brief talk about his experiences and the power of kindness, Sarah stood up and walked toward him. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her smile was steady and bright. "I wanted to surprise you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "These are women you've helped, directly or indirectly, because of what you started. Your kindness didn't just help me. It created a chain reaction." The women stepped forward, one by one, sharing their stories. A single mother who had found shelter during a storm. A young woman who had been stranded after fleeing an unsafe situation. Each of them had been touched by Mike's initiative in some way. Mike stood there, overwhelmed. His heart full as tears pricked his eyes. "I didn't do anything special," he said softly. "I just did what I could. And that was everything," Sarah replied. "You gave us hope when we thought we had none." At that moment, Mike realized just how far a single act of kindness could reach. Later that evening, Mike sat alone in his cab, parked under a canopy of stars. The community center event had left him emotionally drained but profoundly fulfilled. He had never expected to touch so many lives, certainly not with something as simple as giving someone a ride. He thought back to his early days as a taxi driver, the long hours and the quiet nights. Back then, his focus had been on survival, paying bills, supporting his daughter, and making it to the next day. Now, his life had a deeper meaning. The Last Fare initiative had become more than just an act of generosity. It was a symbol of hope. People began sharing their own stories of kindness, inspired by his example. Local media picked up the story, and donations started pouring into the nonprofit, allowing them to expand their work even further. Mike no longer felt like just a cab driver. He was a part of something larger, a movement that reminded people of the power of human connection. He wasn't just earning a living, he was making a difference. As he turned the key in the ignition, a small smile played on his lips. His phone buzzed, and a message from his daughter popped up. "So proud of you, Dad. You're amazing." He stared at the words for a moment, his heart swelling. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, Mike felt ready to face it. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, "It's the smallest acts of kindness that take us the farthest." And with that, he drove off into the night, ready for the next story, the next connection, the next ride that could change a life. The night was quiet as Mike cruised through the familiar streets of the city, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. His taxi, now a symbol of hope for so many, carried not just passengers but stories, each one weaving into the tapestry of his new life. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was a notification from the nonprofit Lisa had introduced him to. They were launching a new program inspired by the Last Fare initiative, aiming to connect people in crisis with immediate support, transportation, and safe shelter. Mike's name was mentioned prominently as the catalyst for the project. He chuckled softly, shaking his head in disbelief. He had never set out to change the world, just to make it through another shift. But now, it seemed, his simple acts of kindness had become something much bigger. As he turned onto a quiet street, a young woman waved him down. She carried a small duffel bag, her expression cautious but hopeful. Mike pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked with a familiar warmth in his voice. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, thank you." As she settled into the back seat, Mike glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Her tired eyes mirrored the same pain and uncertainty he'd seen in Sarah's that night. "Take your time," he said gently. "Let me know where you need to go." And so, the journey continued, with every passenger, every story, and every moment of connection. Mike was reminded of the profound truth he'd discovered. The smallest gestures of kindness could create ripples that extended far beyond what he could see. As the cab rolled forward, Mike smiled to himself. This wasn't just his job anymore, it was his purpose. Years later, the Last Fare initiative had grown into a citywide movement, touching thousands of lives. Taxi drivers across the community joined Mike in offering free rides to those in need, inspired by his story. The nonprofit Lisa worked with had expanded its reach, creating partnerships with shelters, counseling services, and local businesses to offer holistic support for people starting over. Mike, now semi-retired, still drove his cab a few nights a week. He couldn't bring himself to fully step away from the wheel. This work had become a part of him. Each night, he sought out passengers who might need more than just a ride, offering not only a seat in his taxi but a listening ear and, when needed, a helping hand. Sarah remained a close friend, frequently working alongside him and Lisa to spread awareness about the initiative. Her life had taken a remarkable turn. She had rebuilt herself from the ground up, becoming an advocate for survivors of abuse. She often credited Mike for giving her the strength to begin again, though he always waved off the praise, insisting she had done the hard work herself. Emma, Mike's daughter, had also joined the cause after graduating college. She used her position as a teacher to organize community drives and events, honoring the lessons her father had taught her about compassion and resilience. One evening, as Mike drove through the city, he saw a familiar sight. A young driver, a Last Fare decal on the cab window, pulling over to help someone in need. Mike smiled, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over him. "Funny how life works," he murmured. "One small act can start a wave you never see coming." With that, he drove into the night, his heart full, knowing his legacy was no longer his alone. It belonged to the countless lives he had touched, and the many more yet to be reached.